Alrighty, in this video what we're going to do is set up hot reloading for our React components. So we've already seen hot reloading work with our styles, and that makes a whole lot of sense, right? Change a style and it refreshes the style without requiring you to do a refresh. But you can also do that with React components. In fact, you can do it with any sort of arbitrary JavaScript code using Webpack. But initially, when I started reading about hot reloading of JavaScript, it left a really bad taste in my mouth. I generally don't like the concept of hot reloading scripts. I don't like the concept of edit and continue, debug mode, stuff like that. The reason is because a bug in your code can, if it's executed, it could cause your application state to become corrupt. It can cause your application state to be invalid. And even if you fix that bug, and then hot reload or patch in that fix into the running application, it's possible that because of that bug existing previously, your application state is now invalid in such a way that all continued testing in that instance of that application is now also invalid. So I never really liked that concept. But if you write React code in an idiomatic way, the way React code is intended to be written, where React is nothing more than a bunch of JavaScript code, your React code is nothing more than a bunch of JavaScript that describes how to take your application state and render it out into a DOM, into HTML. If you do it like that, then replacing or hot reloading your components will not, or rather should not, put your application into an invalid state. Meaning you should be able to safely replace those components on the fly in the same instances. I already brought up this example, I believe, but imagine for a second we have our game and we have 5 Chrome windows open on that game. They're all playing a game. The game is halfway through. And we want to make some minor change to the way the HTML is being generated. We want to add a div or add a span or change a class name, something like that. And being able to do that, being able to go in, change your React component, hit Control-S, and have that change applied to all 5 browser instances without having to refresh each one, recreate a game, rejoin a game, will save a substantial amount of time. And as long as you treat your React code well, and we are going to be talking about how we architect our React code and what should and shouldn't be done within it, if you treat it well, then doing that won't cause your application state to become invalid or corrupt. Now, we are not going to be hot reloading any of our business logic or any of the code that interacts with the server. So that's important to understand. We're not going to be hot reloading our actions or our stores or our socket.io code or anything like that, because that does lead into the earlier problem that I posed where you can have a bug that puts your application in invalid state. Whether or not you fix that bug, that application state is now invalid. Now, with Webpack, we can hot reload any arbitrary JavaScript that we want by accessing the module.hot property. Basically, what we can say in Webpack code, if we're using Webpack and HMR and the Webpack dev server or the Webpack hot middleware, we can actually say, hey, I want this file to be able to be reloaded whenever it changes. And then I want to execute some code that, if a change comes and this module gets reloaded, I want this code to then execute. And so what we can basically do is we can write code that says, hey, if this module changes, or if the app container module changes, then go ahead and re-render that entire thing out. Now, that has some problems. It has 2 problems with it, but I'm first going to show you guys how we would write it in a very naive way, and then I'll tell you guys the 2 problems and how we can fix it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap our React DOM.render inside a function. And I'm going to call this function, I don't know what I want to call this function. How about render app or main? So everything in our main function is like the bootstrap for the application. Then I'm going to immediately invoke main. So it might seem a little weird why I would write a function then just immediately invoke it. But the reason I want to do it like this is I want to then write code that tells Webpack, hey, if the module components app ever changes, I want to reload that app container and then re-render it out without changing the application. Now, we have to make a change to main to do this, and that is we have to change our import app container from components app. We have to change that to inside of main. We have to say const app container equals require components app and move that out. Now what will happen is every time I invoke main, the app container component will be reloaded. So that's really important to understand. Now, the require syntax here is equivalent to our import statements up here, except we can put require anywhere in our file, whereas we can only have import statements at the top. And Webpack understands the require method. It's just basic CommonJS style code, just basic, like you would do in Node, you'd use the require method. And Webpack understands it and will hook that up for us. So now we have to say, if module.hot, which hot will be a property added to module if we are in debug mode and if we are hot reloading things. If module.hot, I want to say module.hot.accept components app, followed by a callback. And this callback will be invoked whenever this module changes. So now what we're saying is, we want to accept whenever components app changes, we now want to invoke this code. And what code do we want to invoke? Well, we simply want to invoke main. And main is just going to reload that component and then re-render it out by React. And this is not doing anything special with React at all. This is just straight up normal Webpack code. So let's go ahead and execute it. So I'm going to go ahead, open up a command prompt, and I'll do gulp dev. So you can do this module hot and module replace on any module that you want. You can even have it accept itself. And if you accept itself, then whenever this module changes, then that code will execute. Now it's important to understand that, where are you? Output. I don't know, it's probably thinking. There it is. It's important to understand that the module hot accept for this component will be invoked whenever this module changes or whenever a dependency of this module changes. So let's say the components app.js imported a million different other subcomponents. If any of those subcomponents imported by app.js changes, it will trigger this code to execute. So now I should be able to, I'm going to hop over to Chrome, get that loaded. Now we have our Chrome window, and it looks like we're getting probably an error here. Warning. Type must not be null. What am I doing here? Oops. I'm going to leave this in the video because I totally forgot something. When you do a require and you're using Babel to compile your ES 2015 import and export syntax into CommonJS, the default export will be .default. So since this is the default export and it doesn't have a name, we have to, instead of doing app container equals require components app, we have to do app component require components app dot default. Now we should be able to come here and refresh, and now we see our hello world. Now if I come over to app.js and then type in hey there and put an exclamation point and hit Control S, we have hot reloading. Now there's two problems with this. The first problem, let's address the first problem first. The first problem is, if I put code on my app container, let's put in a component did mount, and say console log hey there, and hit Control S. Notice how that's executed, that hey there, that component did mount is executed every single time I make a change and it hot reloads. This is going to become problematic, because what's happening is this entire component, the entire component hierarchy is being destroyed and recreated every time this React DOM.render gets executed. So every time React DOM.render gets executed, the entire component hierarchy gets destroyed and recreated, and that can cause problems because, for example, we'll lose state. Like if app.js had any state in it, used the component state at all of that would be lost. We don't want that to happen. We want basically what we want to do is we just want the entire application to be re-rendered with new rendering code attached to it. So what we're going to do is we are going to use a package that we've already downloaded to do that for us. And that is so we already have package.json, that is react-hot-loader. So go ahead and npm install that if you haven't already. And now we have to hook this in to our application a little bit in order for it to hook into React, and then say, whenever there's a hot reloading instance, that the components won't be replaced, they will simply be updated with the new logic, so that we don't lose things like our state, or any other code that we might have executed in our component did mount or whatever. And this requires two changes. The first change, inside of our Babel RC, we have to add a new plugin. And what this will do is that Babel plugin will then go and add some additional code into each of our components, which will register those components with the React hot loader. And I'll show you what that code adds. So let's go ahead and add a new plugin to Babel RC, and it's going to be react-hot-loader/Babel. Hit Control S. Now let's go ahead and see what that adds. Because I changed our Babel RC, I have to relaunch the Gulp dev task. So let's go ahead and wait for that to execute. All right, bundle is now valid. So I can come over here and refresh, and I can view page source, and I can look at build app.js. And what that plugin is going to do is in our app component, or our app container, it's going to add a little bit of code. And the code that it adds is right here, basically. Or, whoops, well, it did add that code, but that's not the one I want to show you guys. I want to show you guys this one. This is inside of our app.js components. This is the compiled code for that. We can see our function, we can see our render function, all that fun stuff. And what it does is it adds this code, and this code basically says if the React hot loader global exists, then go ahead and register our components with the React hot loader. So it's going to do this every time it detects that we have a React component. It's going to register it with this global React hot loader. Now we have a problem because the React hot loader component or global variable doesn't exist yet. We actually have to add the React hot loader code to our application, because if I go in here and try to look for it, you'll notice it only gets used, it never gets defined. So how do we define it? Well, to do that, we're going to hop back over to our Webpack configuration, and inside of our if_is_debug, we're going to go ahead and add an additional entry point, or an additional item to our client entry, and the item that we have to add is simply react-hot-loader/patch. And what this code is going to do, now that this code's added to our bundle, it's going to patch the core React library and create that React hot loader global variable so that it'll be then recognized. So if I have that done, I can come over here to my console window, and because I changed the Webpack configuration, let's go ahead and restart our Gulp task. And it started. Now if I come over here to our application and do a hard refresh because we restarted the server, now we can see that hey there, console log hey there is executed on the first mount, but if I change it again and recompile it, notice how there's no longer any hey there at all. The component was not remounted, meaning the entire component hierarchy was not destroyed and recreated, but it was updated. It did get all of our new render methods, all of our new static properties, all of our new everything, and then it went through a new re-render loop. So that'll help with performance, and it'll also make sure that our state, our component state, still exists every time that it refreshes. And if this doesn't, so that's basically the two steps that we have to do to make React hot loader work. And if it doesn't work for you, be sure to check out the React hot loader GitHub repository. The versions are in flux right now. There's a big difference between the first version that I used for the longest time and the version 3, which is currently, I believe, in beta. And check out the documentation there. They have a million different example applications you can take a look at. But basically, to recap the steps, the first thing we have to do is inside of our Client.js, we have to accept changes to our component. Then the second thing we have to do is add the React hot loader/Babel plugin to our Babel RC. The final thing we have to do is in our Webpack config, add the React hot loader/patch to our entry. So there's one more problem with our code, and it's not so apparent right now, but it will be in the future. And it has to do with how we're going to deal with routing. See, inside of our Client.js, we are going to be creating all of our global services and our stores and doing all of our configuration. But we're also going to be configuring we also at some point need to be able to configure our routes. We have our top level components, which will constitute each individual page that we can navigate to. And I don't want to have to say, inside of our Client.js, I don't want to have to say if module hot, then module hot accept components app, then module hot accept components game, and then module hot accepts components, all the other different individual pages we might have on the application. I don't want to have to do that. So what I want to do is I want to create a new JavaScript file that's going to include all of our things like our app container and our game container and all that stuff, and then is going to then have our client.js check it for changes, so that all of our routing, all of our different pages that we have included is all consolidated into one module. Then if any of those components or any subcomponent changes, only eventually that one module will be said to hot reload, because it'll be accepted by client.js. So to do that, let's go over here to the client folder and create a new file called routes. The routes file, and now we haven't talked about routing yet, and we will here in the next section of this series. But for our routes.js, all I'm going to do is now I am going to say import app container from components app. Then I'm going to say export default function. I'm not going to bother naming it, and simply going to return app container for now. It'll do something else different later. Then on my client.js, I'm going to do two changes. First thing, instead of var app container equals require components app, I'm going to say const routes equals require component, or require routes, because routes obviously isn't in the components subdirectory. It's right next to client. We don't have to do it like that. So then const routes equals require routes dot default, and then I'm just going to render out whatever routes returns. Now I can remove our import React from React entirely, because we're no longer using JSX in client.js. And then in the module hot, instead of module hot accept components app, it'll module hot accept routes. So now, whenever routes.js changes, or any component that routes.js includes or imports, it'll be accepted by client.js, and the main function will be invoked again, which will re-require our routes file, and then re-render them out to the mount node. So take a look at these two files. I'm going to pause if you want. So hopping out of that, let's make sure that it still works. You will have to do a refresh. React render invalid component element. Oh, I'm sorry. This code is wrong. Because default is a function, I'm not returning, I'm exporting a function, I'm not exporting JSX. So I actually have to invoke default. So sorry about that. So make sure you invoke default by adding two empty parentheses to your main function. So now we do have to refresh because we changed client.js. And now we're getting a small failing from ESLint. It's not telling us that we need to include React when we use JSX, but of course we do. Because we're using JSX down there, we do have to import React from React. So sorry about that. Go ahead and refresh, and now we have our code again. So basically the few mistakes that I made, you have to be sure to invoke .default, and you have to remember to import React anytime you use JSX. Otherwise, you will get React not defined. So I'm going to leave that in the video because it's a very important lesson to learn and something to get used to. With that out of the way, we should be hot reloading this module. So let's go ahead and come over to components app.js and change it, and it updates. So yeah, that's basically about it. So as far as the structural changes to the application that we did, well, let's change this to hello world instead of an exclamation point. As far as the changes, all we did was we created a routes.js file. We export a default function which returns within JSX app.container, so it actually invokes the react.createElement method. Then we made our main function that included our routes and renders our routes. And then if our routes file ever changes, we re-invoke our main. And that's it. As far as React hot reloading, that's all we need to do. So with that, I guess we'll see you guys in the next video.